The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, tucked away on a quiet, wooded ridge overlooking a private lake. The water shimmered like glass in the early mornings, disturbed only by the occasional call of loons or the rippling wake of a canoe. It wasn't a large place, but it was perfect, a sanctuary for solitude, fishing, and the kind of peace that most people spent their whole lives chasing. My parents had passed it down to me with one condition: keep it private and keep it respected. That lake wasn't just any body of water. My grandfather had bought the land outright decades ago, including the rights to the lake itself. The deed was clear, the boundaries unmistakable, and every neighbor in the surrounding area knew the rules. It wasn't a community lake. It wasn't for public enjoyment. It was ours. For years, no one had challenged that. The cabin was well off the main road, accessible only by a gravel trail that wound through the forest. Anyone who ended up on my land had to make a deliberate choice to ignore the private property. No trespassing signs nailed into the pines. It was rare to see anyone but invited family or a close friend on the dock. Rare until the day the new Homeowners Association president decided that rules didn't apply to her. Her name was Linda, though everyone in the neighborhood had started whispering Karen when her name came up. She had moved into a newly built house just outside the perimeter of our land about 6 months back, and within weeks, she was throwing her weight around. First, it was the mailboxes. She insisted everyone in the area use uniform decorative posts. Then it was the garbage bins. She threatened fines for people who left them out past pickup. It didn't matter that some of us weren't part of her HOA. She acted as if her word extended over everyone. I ignored most of it. Her little crusades didn't affect me. At least not until that summer afternoon when I pulled into the cabin and found her guests scattered across my property like it was their weekend retreat. There were cars parked on the gravel pull-off, engines still warm, their trunks spilling over with coolers and folding chairs. Music was blasting from a portable speaker, echoing across the once serene lake. On the dock, kids splashed into the water, while adults lounged with beers in hand, their laughter carrying far and wide. I froze at the sight. My family's cabin sat behind them, blinds drawn, as if it were nothing more than a prop for their party. At first, I thought maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe they were lost. But the sight of Linda sitting comfortably in a lawn chair, sunglasses perched on her nose like a queen surveying her kingdom, told me everything I needed to know. They knew this wasn't theirs. They just didn't care. I parked my truck and walked down toward the dock, making my presence known. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and an awkward silence crept in. It was almost comical how quickly their laughter dried up. But Linda didn't move. She didn't apologize, didn't even act surprised. She sipped her drink and offered me a smug smirk that boiled my blood. The confrontation was brief. I made it clear that this was private property, that they had no right to be there, and that they needed to pack up and leave immediately. Some of the guests grumbled. Others looked embarrassed, and within minutes they were folding chairs, tossing towels into bags, and trudging back to their cars. But Linda stayed defiant, insisting she had the right to access the lake because her HOA managed the area. I told her to check the deed records if she doubted me, but until then, she and her friends had no business here. Eventually, even she stood up, muttering something about community rights as she stormed off. I thought that was the end of it. But just as the last car drove off, I caught sight of her making a phone call at the edge of the driveway. Her voice was raised, and the words trespassing and harassment carried clearly across the clearing. I didn't realize it in the moment, but Linda wasn't just leaving. She was calling the police. And in her version of events, I wasn't the homeowner protecting my family's land. I was the aggressor who had kicked innocent neighbors off community property. The real trouble was just beginning. The first squad car rolled down the gravel road not 20 minutes later, dust rising in a pale cloud behind its tires. My heart sank as I watched it pull into the small clearing by the cabin. A second car followed, lights flashing, though their sirens were off. This wasn't the kind of place police usually visited. In fact, it was rare to even see them this deep into the woods. The only reason they were here was because Linda had spun her story fast enough to make it sound urgent. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts as they surveyed the scene. Behind them, Linda emerged from her car like a triumphant general, phone still clutched in her hand. Her sunglasses were gone now, and her face was twisted into an expression of righteous indignation. She wasted no time launching into her version of events. She told them she had organized a community gathering at the lake, that she had every right to use the property, and that I, a violent and aggressive man, had threatened her guests and forcibly kicked them out. She painted herself as a victim, a woman just trying to enjoy the sunshine with friends, only to be confronted and intimidated. I stood a few paces back, arms folded, jaw tight. It was like watching someone rewrite history in real time, twisting every detail into a narrative designed to favor her. The guests who had left earlier weren't here to back her up, which left it as my word against hers. The officers turned to me, calm but cautious, asking for my side. I explained that the cabin was family property, deeded for generations, and that the lake itself was private. I pointed out the posted signs along the trail, the no trespassing notices nailed clearly to the trees. I reminded them that none of these people had been invited, and that they had been asked, politely at first, to leave. Linda scoffed at every word, cutting in with accusations, and shaking her head like I was lying through my teeth. She insisted the HOA's jurisdiction extended to the lake, that her guests were entitled to use it, and that I was being territorial. The officers, to their credit, didn't take her claims at face value. One of them asked if I had proof of ownership. I did. I kept a copy of the deed and survey maps in the cabin for exactly this reason. Decades of dealing with nosy neighbors had taught my family to keep records close. I retrieved the folder, spreading the documents across the tailgate of my truck so they could review the boundary lines. The maps were clear. The cabin and the surrounding acreage, including the lake, were marked as private property, fully enclosed within the deed. No HOA, no shared access, no gray area. One officer nodded slowly, piecing it together. The other turned to Linda, asking if she had any proof of her claim. She didn't. All she had was her conviction, and a sense of entitlement strong enough to fill the silence. That's when her tone shifted. She grew louder, accusing me of forging documents, claiming the HOA had plans to incorporate the lake into community use, and that my time as sole owner was running out. She even accused the officers of bias, demanding they side with her, because everyone knew the lake should be public. The officers weren't buying it. Their patience thinned as they reminded her that without proof, her claims meant nothing. Trespassing was trespassing, and for what they could see, she and her guests had been in the wrong. But Linda didn't accept that. Not for a second. She stood her ground, arms flailing, voice rising until her words echoed off the trees. To her, this wasn't just about a lake. It was about power, control, and a refusal to admit she had crossed a line. Finally, the officers issued her a warning. If she or her guests returned without permission, she could face fines or charges. They told her to leave, and though she huffed and muttered, she eventually climbed back into her car and sped off in a spray of gravel. For a moment, the clearing fell quiet again. The lake shimmered, the birds sang, and the cabin seemed to exhale with relief. The officers packed up the paperwork, gave me a nod, and left. I thought maybe, just maybe, the ordeal was over, but as I locked the cabin and stood on the dock, staring out the water, a nagging thought took root. Linda wasn't the type to let something go. And sure enough, by the next weekend, the real war over the lake had only just begun. The following weekend, I arrived at the cabin with an uneasy feeling pressing against my chest. The lake was calm, almost too calm, the kind of silence that hinted at a storm waiting to break. And sure enough, it wasn't long before I discovered what Linda had been planning. Her car was parked at the end of the gravel trail, blocking the entrance. Behind it stood a small crowd of HOA board members, clipboard in hand, wearing smug expressions that made it clear they believed they were here on official business. Linda stood in the center, her arms crossed, as if she had personally declared herself sheriff of the lake. This wasn't a social visit. It was an ambush. She announced, loudly and with rehearsed authority, that the HOA had voted to classify the lake as a shared community amenity. According to her, they now had the right to access it, maintain it, and open it to the rest of the neighborhood. She called it progress, a move that would add value to everyone's property. I almost laughed. The audacity of claiming she could vote her way onto land that had been deeded to my family for decades was staggering. But she wasn't joking. She had backup this time, and she was daring me to stop her rather than argue. I went back to the cabin and pulled out the deed once more, along with the contact information from my attorney. The moment I mentioned legal action, their smiles faltered. I reminded them that an HOA had no authority outside of its defined boundaries, and that trying to enforce rules on private property was not only illegitimate, it was harassment. Still, Linda pressed on. She claimed she had spoken to community developers who were interested in purchasing the lake and surrounding land. She threatened that if I didn't comply, I'd be dragged through court until I caved. It was a bluff, but a dangerous one, designed to intimidate me into surrendering. I didn't rise to it. Instead, I documented everything. Photos of the crowd, their cars blocking my property, Linda's threats. Then I placed a call to my lawyer. Within days, he filed a cease and desist order against Linda and the HOA, backed by the clear deed records that proved their actions were baseless. That should have been enough. But Linda couldn't stand the humiliation of losing. When the paperwork arrived, she tried to rally her neighbors again, but this time the tide had shifted. People who once humored her demands were beginning to see the truth. Her crusades weren't about fairness or improvement. They were about control. Her obsession with the lake had exposed just how far she was willing to go, even if it meant dragging her neighbors into a fight they never wanted. Slowly, her support crumbled. One by one, the board members distanced themselves, unwilling to risk legal trouble for her schemes. The calls, the letters, the threats. Eventually, they all stopped. Linda's reign of self-declared authority ended not with a dramatic showdown, but with silence. Summer stretched on, and the lake returned to what it had always been, quiet, private, and mine. I spent evenings on the dock again, listening to the loons call as the sun dipped below the tree-line. Peace had returned, though I knew it had been hard-won. The lesson was clear. Some people can't stand the idea of boundaries, of being told no. They'll twist laws, manipulate stories, and rally others to their cause, all to satisfy their own entitlement. But facts don't bend to willpower. Deeds don't crumble under pressure. And in the end, no matter how loud Linda shouted, the lake was still mine.